Hello, I'm Lee Elsom. In my last video, I explained why I am currently inquiring into Eastern Orthodoxy. One of the biggest questions behind that inquiry is actually quite simple. What did the early church look like? Not what did Roman Catholicism eventually become? Not what does Eastern Orthodoxy look like today? But if we go back as close as we reasonably can to the generations immediately after the apostles, how was Christianity actually organized? Who was in charge? What did bishops do? How were different Christian communities connected to one another? And was there already one bishop governing the entire church? I'm currently reading Timothy Ware, later Metropolitan Kallistos Ware, and his book The Orthodox Church, An Introduction to Eastern Christianity. Rather than wait until I finish the entire book and give one enormous review, I thought I'd stop occasionally and look at some of the questions the book is raising for me. For this video, I'm mainly looking at Chapter 1, The Beginnings, pages 11 to 16 in the 2015 Penguin edition. And later, I'm going to jump forward briefly to pages 25 and 26 because Ware addresses the obvious question all of this eventually raises. Where does Rome fit into the picture? A quick disclaimer. Before we get into the book, one important point. Kallistos Ware was Orthodox, so this is not a neutral history textbook written from nowhere. Ware is explaining the history of Christianity through an Orthodox understanding of the Church. I don't want to make the mistake of saying, Ware says it, therefore Orthodoxy wins. Instead, I want to understand the argument he is making, look at the sources he points towards, and eventually compare those sources with Catholic interpretations as well. So think of this as a reading journal. This is what I'm reading, this is what I find interesting, and these are the questions it is creating for me. So, pages 11 to 12. Where does the church begin? Ware begins chapter 1 with Pentecost. That's the event in the book of Acts where the Holy Spirit descends upon the apostles. Peter preaches, people are baptized, and the first Christian community is established in Jerusalem. From there, Christianity spreads remarkably quickly across the Roman world. By page 12, Ware moves into something particularly relevant to my inquiry. How were those first Christian communities actually organized? Ware describes the basic unit as the Christian community in each city. That community had its own bishop. The bishop was assisted by presbyters, what we would normally call priests, and deacons. And Ware says that this threefold ministry of bishop, priest, and deacon was already present in at least some places by the end of the 1st century. That already interests me because this isn't Christianity as a loose collection of completely independent believers. There is structure very early. There is authority. There is sacramental life. And there are recognized leaders. But then Ware introduces someone who makes the picture much clearer. Saint Ignatius of Antioch. So, pages 12 to 13, Ignatius, the Bishop, and the Eucharist. Pages 12 and 13 are probably the part of this chapter that interested me most. Ware turns to Saint Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius was a bishop writing around the beginning of the 2nd century. He was being taken to Rome to be martyred, and during that journey he wrote several letters to Christian communities. Ware says that two things stand out particularly strongly in those letters: the bishop and the Eucharist. The Eucharist means Holy Communion, the sacramental meal in which Christians receive the body and blood of Christ. And what is striking is how central the bishop is to Ignatius's understanding of the church. Ignatius tells Christians to remain united with their bishop. He even writes the famous line, "Wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church." Now, a quick clarification about the word Catholic. Ignatius is writing centuries before the modern division between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. So when he says Catholic Church, we shouldn't simply read the modern denominational divide backwards into the 2nd century. The word here refers to the whole or universal church. both Catholics and Orthodox claim Ignatius as part of their inheritance, which is exactly why he matters for this discussion. So the next question is, what is the local church? Ware then makes an argument in the book that I found particularly interesting. Today, we naturally think of the church as a worldwide organization. Then, underneath that worldwide organization are dioceses, parishes, and individual congregations. Ware argues that Ignatius starts from the other direction. The Christians in a particular place gather around their bishop. They celebrate the Eucharist together, and that local community isn't merely a tiny fraction of the church. Ware's interpretation is that because the whole Christ is present in the Eucharist, the church is genuinely present there in its fullness. That doesn't mean the local church is independent from every other church, but it means the starting point is very local and very sacramental. Bishop, people, Eucharist. And that raises the obvious next question. If every local church gathers around its own bishop, what exactly holds all of these local churches together? Ware moves directly into that question. So, pages 13 to 14, Cyprian and one Episcopate. On pages 13 and 14, Ware turns to Saint Cyprian of Carthage. Cyprian lived in the 3rd century, and Ware uses him to move from the unity of the local church to the unity of the whole church. Cyprian speaks about all bishops sharing in one episcopate. Episcopate or episcopate simply means the office or body of bishops. So there are many bishops, there are many local churches, but there is still only one church. And I think this is an important distinction. The picture isn't every bishop does whatever he wants, but neither is Ware presenting the early church as one bishop governs every other bishop. Instead, the bishops are united with one another in the same faith, the same sacramental life, and the same episcopate. That naturally leads into the next part, councils. So, pages 14 to 16, how does the church make decisions? By pages 14 to 16, Ware's arguments start to come together. If bishops share responsibility for the one church, then when major problems arise, the bishops meet together. That's what a council is. A gathering of bishops to deal with questions affecting the church. Ware traces the principle back to Acts chapter 15. This is usually called the Council of Jerusalem. There was a serious disagreement over what was required of Gentile Christians. The apostles gathered, they discussed the issue, and then they issued a common decision. Acts recorded them saying, "It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us." Ware sees this council-based approach as fundamental to Orthodox thinking about the Church. You may sometimes hear the word conciliarity. It simply comes from the word council. The basic idea is that the Church's bishops act together rather than one bishop simply imposing his personal decision on everybody else. Now, church councils were not always peaceful. Ware himself later gives some fairly entertaining examples of bishops arguing rather enthusiastically. The early church was not a permanent theological tea party, but the principle remains important. Major questions were dealt with together. So, where does Rome fit? At this point, I want to jump forward slightly in the book, because there is an obvious Catholic response to everything I've just said. What about Peter? What about Rome? What about the Pope? And what I find interesting is that Ware does not argue that Rome was insignificant. Quite the opposite. On pages 25 and 26, he explains the Orthodox understanding that all bishops are fundamentally equal in their episcopal office. That doesn't mean every bishop has exactly the same position or responsibility. Certain major cities eventually become especially important. Rome, above all, had a special place. Ware gives several reasons for that. Rome was associated with Peter and Paul. Peter held a special place among the apostles. Rome was the capital of the ancient empire, and during many major theological controversies, the Roman Church developed a strong reputation for maintaining orthodox teaching. So the orthodox argument Ware presents isn't nobody cared about the Bishop of Rome. That would be historically far too simple. The real question is, what did Rome's first place actually mean? So, primacy and supremacy. Ware makes an important distinction here. Primacy means having first place, a position of honor, leadership, or special responsibility. Supremacy means possessing governing authority over everybody else. Ware argues that orthodoxy can recognize a Roman primacy while rejecting Roman supremacy. In Ware's presentation, Rome is the first bishop, but that place doesn't destroy the fundamental equality of the other bishops. He describes the orthodox understanding as the Pope being first among equals. And this is where the book directly intersects with one of the biggest questions in my own inquiry. What I find attractive about this model is that it seems to hold two things together. There is real authority, and this isn't Christianity where everybody reads the Bible for themselves and invents their own church. There are bishops, there are priests, there are deacons, there are sacraments, there are councils, there is apostolic succession, and there's even a form of primacy. But the authority appears to operate through communion between bishops rather than through one bishop governing every other bishop. At least from what I've read so far, that seems to fit the earliest material quite naturally. And that helps explain why Eastern Orthodoxy has become increasingly interesting to me. But there is an important qualification. What this doesn't prove. None of this proves that Eastern Orthodoxy is the true church, and it certainly doesn't disprove Roman Catholicism. A Catholic can respond, of course the structure of the early church was less developed. The church grew. New problems appeared, and the authority that Christ gave to Peter became more clearly understood over time. In other words, Catholicism doesn't need to demonstrate that the Church in AD 107 looked exactly like the modern Vatican. The stronger Catholic argument is that the later papacy represents a legitimate development of something already established by Christ. This is a serious argument, and I don't want to pretend that Ware's interpretation alone answers it. So, the question I'm left with? After reading these sections, my question has become much more precise. It isn't, did Rome matter in the early church? I think it clearly did. The question is, what kind of authority did Rome possess? Was the Bishop of Rome the leading bishop within a communion of bishops? Or did he possess governing authority over those bishops by divine right? And if the stronger Catholic understanding wasn't yet clearly being exercised in the earliest centuries, can it still be considered a legitimate development of the Apostolic Church? That, I think, is where the real argument begins. So, where do I go next? I don't want to rely entirely on Ware. So the next stage of this inquiry needs to involve going directly to sources he is discussing. I want to read Ignatius for myself. I want to examine Cyprian. I want to look more closely at Acts chapter 15. Eventually, I need to investigate the evidence concerning Rome, Peter in the New Testament, Clement of Rome, Irenaeus, the early councils, appeals to Rome, and how Catholics and Orthodox interpret those same sources differently. Because if the papacy really is one of the central dividing questions between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, then slogans from either side aren't going to be enough. So, what did the early church actually look like? From the material I've read so far, I see local churches gathered around bishops and the Eucharist. I see those bishops sharing in one wider church. I see councils being used to deal with disputes. And I see Rome holding a genuinely important first place. What I don't yet clearly see is exactly how far that Roman authority extended. And that distinction between primacy and supremacy may end up being one of the most important questions in my entire inquiry. For now, I'm going to keep reading. And as I do, I'll continue sharing what I find persuasive, what I find difficult, and where I think both sides deserve more investigation. If you're following along, the main section I've used in this episode is from Chapter 1, pages 11 to 16, with the discussion of Rome coming from pages 25 and 26, all from the 2015 Penguin edition. If you've read Kallistos Ware's The Orthodox Church, let me know what stood out most to you. And if you know of good Catholic or Orthodox primary sources dealing with the structure of the early church, feel free to recommend them below. Just keep the discussion respectful. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't already, do please leave a like, comment, subscribe, share, all of that good stuff, and I'll see you guys in the next video. God bless.